The Economist.
It's often thought that the first televised presidential debate was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960. That's not quite right.
Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt and Senator Margaret Chase Smith face the nation.
That was the first televised debate between candidates, but 4 years earlier, two surrogates took part in what was technically the first ever televised presidential debate on CBS's Face the Nation.
Today we have two charming ladies, both top campaigners for their parties in the closing days of this campaign.
Shot in black and white in a small TV studio, a panel of newsmen sat ready to grill the charming ladies. Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith, standing in for President Dwight Eisenhower, and representing Democratic challenger Adlai Stevenson, the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt.
And I think anyone who has watched the situation in the Middle East growing has been longing to see some kind of constructive action on the part of the administration for some time.
It was the height of the Suez Crisis, so foreign policy dominated the discussion. Roosevelt, then probably the most famous woman in America, commanded much of the debate. Smith saved her fire for the end.
Democratic presidents, together with leaders of our allies, chose Dwight D. Eisenhower to lead our nation to victory in World War II.
Accusing the president's critics of inconsistency.
It's strange to see and hear Democratic leaders now accusing him of not being a leader.
Americans went to the polls and re-elected Eisenhower just 2 days later. Voters have a bit longer to digest this week's debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. With 53 days to go until the 2024 election, I'm John Prideaux, and this is Checks and Balance from The Economist. Each week, we take one big theme shaping American politics and explore it in depth. Today, how will this debate shape the rest of the race? On Tuesday night in Philadelphia, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris took part in what might be the only debate between them in this campaign. Despite Trump's claim that it was his best debate ever, the evening was a success for the vice president. The race between them is extremely close. Will the debate make any difference? With me this week to talk about the debate, to talk about where the race stands now and where it's headed next, are Adam O'Neill, coming to us from New Hampshire this week, and Charlotte Howard in New York. Charlotte, how are you doing? What's going on in New York?
I am very well. I'm glad we have a concept of a plan for this episode.
We do have a concept of a plan. Adam, what's going on in New Hampshire? And why are you there? You're all over the country at the moment, which I guess is reasonable given that you're reporting on the campaign.
Well, John, the presidential primary starts earlier and earlier every year, and now it's starting before the previous election even. No, I'm kidding. I just came to Dartmouth to speak to some students for a day.
On concept of a plan for a moment, I think that is such a great phrase. It really is useful in so many different circumstances, specifically if you're a reporter on deadline and you're talking to your editor about what it is that you're writing, and you can just say, I have a concept of a plan.
It's such a good phrase. I had the same thought as well. It's catch-all, whether you're a reporter, whatever you're working on, really. It's like the adult version of the dog ate my homework, I think. For those who are not familiar with the phrase, Donald Trump was asked about his healthcare plan. He was asked for some details of it in the debate, and he replied that he didn't have a plan, but he had a concept of a plan. We have our own concept of a plan on Checks and Balance this week. Normally, to listen to the podcast, you need to be an Economist subscriber. But for the next few weeks, as the election gets closer, we're making our episodes free to everyone. To keep listening after that and enjoy our past episodes, you'll need to be a subscriber to Economist Podcasts Plus. If you go to economist.com/podcasts plus, we're currently running a free trial where you can listen to all of the Economist podcasts. Of course, if you're an Economist subscriber, you get them included too. And we really hope that you'll sign up to carry on listening after that, as this election reaches its no doubt dramatic conclusion. And of course, all our podcasts are also included in a full Economist subscription. All right, let's get on with this week's podcast. Our colleague James Bennet stayed up late on Tuesday night to write this week's Lexington column, which was about the debate. Before this week's debate, he'd written a column arguing that Kamala Harris was a good debater and he expected her to do much better than Donald Trump. I asked him if she met his expectations.
Well, I'll admit to feeling some relief having stuck my neck out last week on that point, but, she performed far better than I had even expected. As I wrote last week, her preparation, her background as a prosecutor, I think really comes through when she debates. And on the other hand, Donald Trump just is not a good debater. He has a very, very poor record. His debate style is much more about upselling people who already love him than it is reaching out to persuadable voters. John, there were so many kind of memorable moments from this debate. It's really unusual in that sense. There were so many kind of revealing or interesting ones that either confirmed kind of what we thought about Trump, but in an important way, or illustrated kind of new dimensions of, her approach to politics that seemed significant.
James, you mentioned there were moments that jumped out. So I'd like to ask you about what those were. I mean, having read your column last week about how Harris's prosecutorial background stands her in good stead, I was looking out for moments where, like somebody who's cross-examining a witness, she would bait the witness into reacting to something that she'd said and throw the witness off course. And you saw that again and again in the debate. Very deliberate tactic.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. I mean, they'd obviously studied Donald Trump, and she was prepared with a series of hooks, really, for him to draw him onto the territory where she wanted to debate. And the effect was to really minimize his attacks on her and the record of the Biden administration and turn the debate largely into an argument over his conduct as president and what she saw as the black marks in his record rather than hers. So the moment that really set the pattern came about a half hour in when the moderators asked her what should have been a tough question, which was basically, why did you guys do nothing on the border for 3.5 years until 6 months before the election? And she very skillfully evaded the question and gave the answer she wanted to on immigration, which was largely about Donald Trump killing the bipartisan bill to strengthen the border earlier this year. And then started talking about his rallies and how people get bored and start leaving. And sure enough, Donald Trump went right to that and started defending his rallies, insisting people love them, saying nobody goes to hers, and then saying, oh, well, the people who do go are being paid to go, and so on, before he worked his way back to immigration and this crazy story, which he repeated about immigrants supposedly eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. It was an example of how she was able to deflect attention from her own record, throw it onto his, and at the same time make him look a little defensive and I think kind of small and petulant.
So she won many of those moments in the debate. Were there bits of the debate where you thought she didn't do well that stick in the memory?
I mean, I thought she got off to a shaky start. There was a move at the very beginning that I think was a strong move on her part. On June 27th, it was very striking to me that Donald Trump and Joe Biden never shook hands. Before the debate even started, she very aggressively strode across the stage, stuck her hand out, and he looked quite surprised. It essentially forced him into a handshake, which was, I thought, a first demonstration of how she was going to kind of assert her dominance over the course of the night. When she answered the first question, which was about the economy, she seemed nervous and a little bit tentative. After that, they got a question about abortion that I think really steadied her down. But I think there were moments throughout where she did miss opportunities to really drive her own points home. There was a question late in the debate about the Afghanistan withdrawal, and the moderator referred to the deaths of 13 soldiers at the airport in Kabul. And she, I think, should have taken a moment to express some sympathy for those soldiers and their families. She just passed right over that in order to make the point she wanted to make, which again, she did quite effectively. She managed to throw Donald Trump on defense, even on his conduct of negotiations. over the Afghanistan withdrawal. That's what they wound up talking about rather than the Biden administration's management of the withdrawal. But I think it was a bit of a tin-eared moment for a candidate who otherwise really went out of her way repeatedly over the course of the night to demonstrate empathy for Americans who are suffering.
James, you and I have had discussions after debates before, and the discussions that folks often have go in two ways. One, there's the go-round about whether debates matter and whether they move the polls, and the conventional wisdom there is no, they don't, but sometimes they do. See Biden's performance. And then there's also a discussion where the debate's almost treated like a boxing match, who won, who had the decisive blows. But the way I think about these is that this is an opportunity for both candidates to rehearse the role, to inhabit the role of being president, and for an opportunity for voters, but also folks like us, to see how they would perform in that role, because all leadership requires some degree of performance, right? And also in the debate format, you are asked a whole load of difficult questions quickfire, and so you can tell something about a candidate's instincts and how they might respond in those situations. So taking that angle on this, what did you take from the debate about how Donald Trump or Kamala Harris might president if they were elected on November 5th?
I think that's really well put, John. And in some ways, it's a funny test, right? Are the qualities of being a good debater necessarily the qualities required to be a successful president? I think the answer is clearly yes, some of them are. Most critically, just the ability to communicate effectively with the American people, which is what I think Joe Biden has largely lost. Kamala Harris showed that she is a very effective communicator. I don't think we learned much about Donald Trump, although I continue to wonder if he isn't showing signs of being an actually less effective version of himself, either because he's so obsessed again with the past and with 2020, or because time is in fact beginning to catch up with him. I just don't know. We didn't learn a lot about policy from this debate, from either of them. I mean, Donald Trump was basically a cipher on the question of his plans for a second term. And Kamala Harris gestured several times at the opportunity economy she wants to create, but that vision is not a highly detailed one at this point. So on substance, I can't say the ball got moved that far down the field. Look, I guess I don't think the stakes were that high for Donald Trump in this debate. I think they were very high for Kamala Harris. If you consider the counterfactual in which we were discussing now, the mediocre or even terrible performance that she had, I think that would probably have had a pretty devastating effect on her campaign. So there was a lot of downside risk to her. How much upside payoff there'll be from this performance is just something we're going to have to wait and see.
Charlotte, we won't spend a whole episode doing post-game analysis, but this was a pretty important debate. I mean, I think James's point about the counterfactual, where Harris did poorly and we were talking about Trump's dominant performance, would have been significant, right? So what did you make of how she did and how this debate went generally?
I thought she did very well. I completely agree with James that she had more to lose, that if she had strung words together in a nonsensical way, as she has in the past, that would have been damaging to her. But there was no word soup. She was very clear. Beyond that, I think she managed to sound serious and not shrill. I think women in this role, Hillary Clinton never got the tone quite right. And I think women have to clear a higher bar tonally on how they present in this role, if I'm candid about it. And I think she also was able to seem serious while connecting on a personal level. She just seemed to be in command and extremely disciplined. I mean, when I think about the two main takeaways as I watched all of her answers, there was the line that she had back at the Democratic convention that Trump is an unserious person with serious consequences. And I think that was hammered home again and again. So that's point one. And then point two, the charge that he's selfish, it's all about him and she's about you, I think is both effective for Trump and effective in the age of Democrats, I think in 2024 versus 2020, trying to move beyond identity politics a bit, that she wants to have this big tent where she's representing all people within America that she's really trying to bring people in. And I think the most effective line that she had in the debate was when Trump was talking about his supposed victory, which of course is false, in 2020. And she said,
"And when you then talk in this way in a presidential debate and deny what over and over again are court cases you have lost because you did in fact lose that election, it leads one to believe that perhaps we do not have in the candidate to my right the temperament or the ability to not be confused about fact. That's deeply troubling, and the American people deserve better."
And then you had Trump respond by praising Viktor Orban.
Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men. They call him a strong man. He's a tough person, smart. Prime Minister of Hungary. They said, why is the whole world blowing up? 3 years ago, it wasn't. Why is it blowing up? He said, because you need Trump back as president.
It was just an exact moment where she was able to skewer him, and then he took it and instead of recovering, had a completely nonsensical answer praising an autocrat. And I thought she was extremely effective.
On that point, I completely agree about Trump. I think people, what they saw from Donald Trump last night was what they've sort of come to expect from him over the past 9 years. But that said, I do think James was onto something about his decline. If you watch the 2015-2016 primary debates, Trump was snappier, and he wasn't some policy wonk back then, but he had better comedic timing. When he would hit back at his opponents in the debates, there was a little bit more zing to it. And this time, he never really got any good lines in. And he had a couple of opportunities there throughout the debate. When Vice President Harris brought up his rallies, it was at the end of her dodging a question about immigration. And if Donald Trump were a disciplined debater, he would have said something like, let's not be childish and talk about rallies. Why don't you try to actually answer the question on immigration? But of course he can't do that. It's Donald Trump. So instead, he just got into an argument about actually people love my rallies and, they always stay or whatever he did. And I think that points to a bigger problem with, in addition to his own inability to control himself, and you could almost see it on his face that he sort of knew he shouldn't be doing this and he was warned. And I'm sure all of his advisors were just horrified that he had taken the bait. You also got a sense that Donald Trump was becoming a little too online, which ironically was the problem with the Harris campaign in 2020 was that it was too focused on what online activists say. So most Americans don't know who Viktor Orban is, but a certain kind of right-wing online guy is really into Viktor Orban and is excited about his fertility policy or him standing up to Brussels. But most people just thought, who is he talking about? It's not the president of China or the president of Russia, someone people might actually know. And with all of that said, for as bad as the debate went for Trump and for all of his missed opportunities and for the pretty solid performance that was turned in by the vice president, I'm just curious to see what the polling looks like in a week. Thinking someone won the debate is different from, now I'm motivated to come out and vote for this person, or, I'll change my vote. But if we can see some kind of shift in momentum, maybe when you break down demographic groups where she might be gaining, that's going to be really interesting to see in the coming days to judge just how much of an effect this has on the campaign.
I thought that his debate against Biden, he obviously didn't have to do that much because Biden performed so poorly. But I thought that he did pretty well in that. And in some ways, Biden's extremely poor performance in June masked that Trump, by his standard at least, did pretty well. He had that smug, superior, somewhat funny thing going on. And I'll say, for the record, that the differing standards for each candidate, for Joe Biden, for Trump, for Kamala Harris, is so striking. I mean, the standard for Joe Biden then was extremely low. He didn't clear it. Trump has his own weird standard. People expect him to say odd things. They expect him to lie, say nonsense. By that standard, he did pretty well in June. In this debate, I don't think he cleared his own rather odd bar. He, to me, felt angry, defensive, agitated, a little desperate. I mean, you think about the issues that Harris would have prepped on, be prepared for an answer on Afghanistan, be prepared for an answer on immigration, be prepared for an answer on eating pets. Like, it's just really weird. And he had two roads. He could have taken the path toward seeming serious. He had the option to be presidential sober. We know that his advisors were very, very focused on just maintain discipline, seem calm, seem in command. And instead, he didn't take that path. He went 100 miles an hour toward Weirdville of killing babies, executing babies, and that being the supposed policy in various states, and eating cats. And then he ended with this warning of nuclear annihilation, which to me felt very much like a rant of a grandpa sitting in a corner. He said, we're going to end up in a third world war. It will be a war like no other because of nuclear weapons, the power of weaponry. It was very, very dark, but also odd. And I completely agree with you, Adam, that the real question is what next, which we'll talk about more.
We'll take a look at Adam's question of whether this will move the polls a bit later, and we'll also take a closer look at Harris and Trump's rhetorical styles in a moment. It is worth noting the Nielsen ratings say that more than 67 million people watched the debate. So if that's accurate, that's a large slice of the electorate. 155 million people voted in 2020. So 67 million is a lot of eyeballs. But Charlotte, before we get there, and for anyone who's perhaps new to Economist podcasts, hasn't listened to us before, and is thinking of joining us as a subscriber, what do they get?
Well, you get weekly shows on not just American politics, but on business, on tech and science. My personal favorite is Drum Tower on China. I think it's the single best podcast to understand a country that is often incomprehensible. And then we have these fantastic limited series. John, you made one on the baby boomers' effect on American politics. We've had award-winning series on Xi Jinping, on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So in my view, they're level-headed, deeply reported, unique podcasts. They're different than everything else out there. They're global. They draw on the expertise of our reporters around the world. So I think it's a fantastic stable of shows.
Yeah, I endorse all of that. And you can sign up for a free trial by searching Economist Podcasts. Lane Greene is a senior editor at The Economist and our resident linguistic guru. He's been studying Donald Trump and Kamala Harris over the past few years to get a sense of their distinctive rhetorical approaches.
Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have very different speaking styles. For one thing, Trump talks.
Friends, delegates, and fellow citizens, I stand before you this evening with a message of confidence.
And talks.
With faith and devotion, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
And talks.
This shows the level of my, most people go out, they hire consultants, they pay millions of dollars.
His speech at the Republican National Convention in July was reportedly scripted to last for 40 minutes. Instead, it went on for over an hour and a half.
God bless the United States of America, our great country. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Kamala Harris's convention speech, by contrast.
So let me start by thanking my most incredible husband, Doug.
Was a tight 38 minutes.
Let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told.
Donald Trump also crams a lot more in. During that convention speech, he spoke at an average of 128 words per minute. Harris managed just 97 at the DNC, meaning he got in over 3 times as many words as her. Harris is a more considered speaker. In her vice presidential debate with Mike Pence in 2020, she uttered 17% fewer words than him, despite speaking for the same amount of time. And she carefully controlled his interruptions.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking. Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well, wait.
I'm speaking. In 1864...
Well, I'd like you to answer the question.
No, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking. Okay.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking became the most famous line from that debate. And while she was speaking, she often seemed to be back in her old job as prosecutor.
On January 28th, the Vice President and the President were informed about the nature of this pandemic. They were informed that it's lethal in consequence, that it is...
Methodically making her case against the Trump administration.
And they knew what was happening, and they didn't tell you.
Trump's rally speeches can often stray into incoherence.
We want warriors. That's what we need. And they're friends of mine, and they fought by my side, and we've done so many things. Right to try. We all know what right to try is. You're terminally ill, and you weren't able to get our space-age great medicines, cures.
But Trump has come up with his own term for this rambling approach, the weave.
You know, I do the weave. You know what the weave is? I'll talk about like 9 different things, and they all come back brilliantly together. And it's like, and friends of mine that are like English professors, they say, it's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen.
According to analysis by Mark Liberman, a linguist at the University of Pennsylvania, Trump has an unusually unvaried vocabulary. He uses the fewest distinct or different words of any public figure Liberman has studied. In the debates in 2020, it took Trump around 6,000 words to use 1,000 distinct words. It took Harris somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. A big vocabulary may be useful for Scrabble, but Trump's more limited rhetorical style is good at getting his points across. He repeats himself and deploys words that everyone knows and uses frequently.
We're going to build a wall, and we will make America great again.
This helps his messages stick. At the debate on Tuesday night, their contrasting styles were evident. Harris deployed her classic prosecutorial approach.
Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Donald Trump left us the worst public health epidemic in a century. Donald Trump left us the worst attack on our democracy.
And used Trump's reputation for muddled rhetoric against him.
You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early.
If Harris was often on the attack, Trump became defensive.
People don't leave my rallies. We have the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics.
And his tendency to veer towards the nonsensical was also on display.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
Kamala Harris's linguistic approach is more suited to a debate format than Donald Trump's. And it showed.
Adam, you yourself are an exponent of the weave. What did you make of the cat-eating part of the debate?
Well, I have 8 ideas about that. Let me quickly weave them all together, and they'll come together perfectly. And, you know, I have some English professor friends who listen to the podcast who I am sure will have a high opinion of it. But, yeah, what was striking about the cats and dogs thing, and this is something you've seen from Trump going back to 2016, is if you're really into the news and you follow things closely, you can figure out what he's talking about. But if you don't, you're sort of puzzled. He'll make references to things and you'll be like, for example, when Donald Trump is explaining his position on abortion, he'll tell the history of himself with the issue where he'll say, well, you know, in 2016, I made a list. And then we got the judges and, you know, there was Kavanaugh and we had that lady. And people are kind of confused by it if they don't follow the news closely. But if you do, you can piece together what he's trying to talk about. And I think that even extends to policy sometimes. When Donald Trump was trying to talk about abortion, for example, he was quoting a governor who had said something.
Look at the governor of West Virginia, the previous governor of West Virginia, not the current governor who's doing an excellent job, but the governor before. He said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby.
It wasn't really clear what he had said or when he had said it or what the context was. But if you're really into news, you can kind of piece together some idea of what he's trying to articulate when it comes to policy, even if for the average person who's not online, it's a little tougher to decipher what he means.
On the weaving, I had never heard that speech where he referred to his skill in this regard. I absolutely love the idea that Trump hangs around with a lot of English professors. I'm imagining some bizarro book club of him sitting with them reading Middlemarch. One thing about the debate that I was processing in real time and wondering about as I watched it was that he did get more airtime. I mean, this is a man who always digresses. We know this. When you sit at the convention, you can see these giant teleprompters with what he's supposed to say, and then you can look at him and hear the complete other tangent that he has catapulted himself down. He never sticks to the script. In a debate forum, he always wants to interject, and the moderators did have several instances in which they were trying to get him to answer the next question, and instead he kept pushing back, and he was able to make a point that he wanted to. And the result was that he got about 5.5 more minutes of speaking time than Harris did. And that is no bad thing for the Democrats. The more minutes that he talks, the more material they get. And they can use his comments again and again. And I think that's a takeaway from this debate when you think about its impact going forward. Not just how many people watched it in the moment, but what can they do with all this material that Trump gave them of looking defensive, of saying odd things. You don't have to do too much splicing to make him look doddering and unserious.
Yeah, there's a great moment when I think he's trying to fact check something that Harris had said, and she had a couple of whoppers mixed in with the debate, but his reference or his citation was he started listing names of Fox News hosts, saying, "Oh, this has been debunked. I just asked, Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham," and I think most people might have been, I don't know, if they knew who that was. It's not exactly an authority on fact checking.
Yeah, Adam, there was a mini controversy after the debate about the moderator's role in the fact-checking. I don't think we really need to discuss that. They did a good job as far as I could tell. But on that point, I was also reminded by Donald Trump's system of information gathering, if you can put it that way, when he was discussing the non-existent cat eating in Springfield and Aurora. He was challenged on that, and the moderator said, well, we called the city manager and they said there were no reports of this. And it's also true that the police departments in these cities haven't reported any incidents of people eating pets. However, when Donald Trump was challenged on it, he said, well, I saw someone said it on TV, so it's true. And it was a bit of a reminder for me that when he was president, he had the entire intelligence community, America's diplomatic service at his disposal to furnish him with information. The whole of the federal government, civil service and all the rest of it. And yet very often what he relied on was online rumor, and he seems to be unable to categorize information in different ways. If he sees something on TV and it suits his priors, it's true. Adam, you wrote a great piece recently on the Trump campaign reorientating itself, retooling to attack Kamala Harris rather than facing Joe Biden. And you looked at ad spending and what was in the Trump campaign's ads. Having watched the debate, how much of Trump's performance was informed by that strategy?
There were very few great moments for Donald Trump. There was no one line that everyone will remember, like in his debate against Biden when he said, I don't know what he just said, and I don't think he does either. He didn't get any of those lines in, but you could see him kind of clawing toward some of the themes that are appearing in his ads, which are attacking Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on immigration, the economy, and in particular inflation, and sort of the general chaos around the world. And I'm positive that his advisors were telling him, just stick to that, keep hammering them on that, and don't talk about anything else, and you'll win the election. And that might be true. But he didn't have a great job of doing that. And I think it's sort of one of his greatest political strengths, but also one of his biggest problems is his inability to not totally exaggerate everything. He can't just say, Kamala Harris is to the left of the average American on economics, and it's a bad idea. He has to say she's a Marxist, right? And he can't just say they underestimated the problem with the illegal immigration and they haven't done a good job of containing it. He's saying they're letting these people pour in and eat your cats. And some of his campaign ads are a bit over the top, but if he had dialed it back a bit and maybe taken some bigger hits on just one or two issues, but he just can't help himself and goes from 0 to 100 every time. And I think that's where, even if he has a lot to work with in those attacks, by exaggerating so much, I think some people roll their eyes and say, well, she's not a communist. That sounds a little crazy.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I normally think of Trump's wild exaggerations as being pretty effective rhetorically. But I think you might be right, Adam. It might be that they're counterproductive. Okay, we'll be back in a moment to talk about where this race stands as it enters the final stretch. Owen Winter is a political data scientist at The Economist and one of the people involved in building and running our forecast model. I wanted to get a sense from him of where the race stands going into the last 7 or so weeks. But first, he told me what the Snap post-debate polls reveal.
So they're typically conducted by pollsters who have a panel of respondents who they can speak to before and after the debate. So you get a nice comparison. They're kind of variable quality, but a really sort of high quality pollster that conducts one is SRSS with CNN. So that's probably the most prominent one we've seen. They had theirs out minutes after the debate. It felt like it was really impressive. And then there'll be more coming out over the next few days that are kind of typical voting intention surveys.
And you reminded me earlier that Hillary Clinton won these Snap polls in 2016, right? So Harris seems to have won the debate, if you want to phrase it in those terms, and the Snap polls have been good for her. That doesn't mean this is a race-turning event.
Harris had some really impressive numbers, I thought. The CNN poll goes all the way back to 1984, which is really helpful. But she was definitely one of the top-performing candidates to have been in a presidential debate. She won 63% to Trump's 37% when debate watchers were asked who they thought had won. But as you say, lots of candidates have won the debates and then gone on to lose. Romney had a very good debate in 2012, the first one against Barack Obama, went on to lose. Clinton did very well against Donald Trump and then went on to lose. And actually, one of the other kind of top performers from historic presidential debates is Donald Trump in June's debate against Joe Biden.
And Owen, this is the first time we've had you on Checks since we've relaunched The Economist's patented WYSI election forecast model. Can you remind our listeners, first of all, how that's put together? And then could you also say something about how it's changed in response to the candidate dropping out and being replaced by Kamala Harris?
So the Economist presidential forecast is essentially a combination of opinion polling, both nationwide opinion polls and state-level opinion polls, and fundamentals data about the election. So things like the president's approval rating and how states voted last time, things that are more static than opinion polls. And then with some statistical wizardry, we work with partners at Columbia University, a group of statisticians. We kind of quantify how uncertain polling is at this stage of the election and use that to project forward which way the race might go. So in some ways, incorporating Harris into that model was quite simple. It's just sort of a case of letting Joe Biden's polls drop out and replacing them with Kamala Harris polls. But then we did have to make some tweaks. So, for example, Joe Biden, when he was in the model, he was feeling the effects of the economy, whereas we find in our kind of historic analysis that candidates who aren't an incumbent president don't feel an effect from the economy. So that just drops out of the model. And the effect it had was initially the model just became a lot more uncertain. So we went from having a lot of polls to not many polls, which meant it kind of lent more on fundamentals data. On the first day that we reran the model, once Harris was a candidate, we gave Donald Trump a 57% chance of winning the election. But as more polling has come through for Harris, it's been quite positive. She's doing relatively well in swing states, and now she has a 51% chance of winning the election. So it's about as close as it could be to a toss-up.
Right. And if anyone listening hasn't checked out the forecast model and wants to do so, if you just Google Economist presidential model, some variation of that, you can find it. Owen, one of the reasons why this race is so close at this point is the way that the polls and our prediction of how the vote will go in November interacts with the Electoral College, America's peculiar, antiquated system for picking a president. You've done some work in this week's Economist looking at the size of the Electoral College penalty that Harris will pay. Or another way of putting that is looking at how far she needs to be ahead in the popular vote in order to win in the Electoral College. So what's the answer to that? Because there's been quite a lot of debate this year about, is the Electoral College still as bad for Democrats as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by miles and lost in the Electoral College? How big's that penalty now?
The way we quantify the Electoral College in our model is using state polls primarily. And so in state polls conducted recently, Kamala Harris has been doing okay. She's leading in a couple of them, Michigan and Wisconsin, she's got a couple of points lead. Pennsylvania is kind of like a perfect toss-up, really hard to say which way it will go. And she's behind in the rest of the swing states. But between them, she has multiple routes to 270 electoral votes. But it's worth saying that all of those states are a little bit to the right of the country, a little bit more Republican than the country as a whole. So in national polls, she's leading by maybe 2 or 3 points. Whereas in Pennsylvania, which is likely to be the so-called tipping point state needed for 270 electoral votes, it's basically tied. So that suggests there's maybe a 2 or 3 point gap between the country and the Electoral College. So when we run it through the model, which includes state polls and fundamentals forecasts, it looks like the point at which Kamala Harris becomes favored to win the Electoral College is if she has a 2.1 percentage point lead or larger. But it's very uncertain. So there's some scenarios in our model where Harris wins the Electoral College just with 1 percentage point of lead. There's some where Trump wins the Electoral College despite being behind by as much as 3 or 4 points.
So just to boil that down to a line, she needs to be 2.1 points ahead in the national popular vote to be favoured to win in the Electoral College, i.e. to have a more than 50% chance of winning in the Electoral College.
Yes, it's a bit of a word salad, but to have a greater than 50% chance of winning the presidency and winning the Electoral College, Harris needs to be ahead by at least 2.1 percentage points.
Charlotte, I wrote a leader for this week's Economist about America's kludgy system for electing its presidents. And as part of that work, I had an email exchange with Owen when I was asking him how close is this race compared with races in the past. And his view was if you take the polling where it is now and layer over that Electoral College penalty that we were just talking about, this is, at this point, in early September, this is the closest race since polling began.
Yes, it's a real nail-biter. I've been struck by the lawn signs that I see around because there is such strong conviction within each camp here. The Harris Walls sign that I saw recently was Harris Walls, obviously, which suggests that there's no other possible choice and suggests that the person who put that sign out may not know many Trump supporters. And there's a similar vibe on the Republican side. But of course, the polling remains really, really close. And I think one thing that is rhetorically interesting from the debate is that Harris is ideologically trying to set up a big tent, right? She's trying to bring people in. She's trying to suggest that she can represent all Americans, that she's a force for reason and for American principles, compared with Trump, who is small and narrow. And if her rhetoric is more of a big tent, Trump's is like a tiny little umbrella, one of those little folding ones you buy for $5 when it's just started raining. But actually, there's so many people, of course, who support him and who voted for him in the last election. He's right in the debate to point out the massive turnout that he got in 2020. So, yeah, it's going to be extremely, extremely close.
On the subject of the Electoral College, I may be the only person here who sees some of the virtues of the Electoral College, and it's some of its drawbacks are well known. But I would just point out two things. One is that when a candidate wins an absolute majority, more than 50%, they virtually always win the Electoral College. I think the one time that wasn't the case was in the 19th century. But Al Gore only won something like 48% of the vote. Hillary Clinton also did not cross the 50% barrier. But Joe Biden did. He won, I think, about 51%. So if you win a plurality, you aren't guaranteed a victory through the Electoral College. But absolute majorities, clear definitive wins, tend to reward candidates, because I know some people view it as anti-democratic. And another thing in defense of the old antiquated system is if we do have a close race, and I think it's hard to know because the Trump campaign would be operating differently. He would be spending time in places like New York or California, where there still are a lot of Republicans living, and the strategies would be different. But let's say there is a very close race out of 150, 180 million votes cast, whatever it ends up being, if it comes down to a couple 100,000. With the Electoral College, you can narrow it down to a recount in 1 or 2 states. But in that case, I think you would have to have a recount in 50 states. And if you thought Florida was utterly chaotic in 2000, imagine 50 states recounting all of their votes simultaneously to try to certify exactly how many, because even if it wasn't close in that state, if the margins changed by 5,000 or something per state, that could change the outcome of the overall election. So as for whatever difficulties the Electoral College presents, in one way at least, this what will be a very close election, this may be a neater way of resolving it, or not a neater way, but a less messy way in some sense.
That is the best defense I think I've ever heard of America's absolutely bonkers system for electing presidents. Though, Adam, I think you may have your California driving license revoked for making it.
Yeah, well, I have a DC driving license now, but...
Even worse.
It's a bit funny analyzing the impact of this debate and looking at polls nationally, because with this race, so much just comes down to Pennsylvania. And there are two things arising from the debate that I think are important. One is that Harris's answer on fracking, I think she did a good job of explaining the Biden administration's record here, which has been extremely pro-oil. She rightly and correctly pointed out the record oil production during this Biden administration. And interestingly, pointed to oil leasing as something not to be ashamed of, but to tout. This was a part of the Inflation Reduction Act that hitherto Democrats, particularly more progressive Democrats, were somewhat embarrassed by. They saw this concession to link oil leasing with some of the other leasing, for instance, for offshore wind. They saw this as, one of the compromises, unfortunate compromises that had to be made to get the bill over the line. This was something that now she's proud of. So I thought that was interesting and I think is important in Pennsylvania. And then tactically, really for the Trump administration, I'm fascinated by whether they, in a state like Pennsylvania, double down on turnout or try to convince some people on the margin. Because particularly for Trump, I'm not sure that you can do both. Can you really turn out Trump supporters in rural Pennsylvania without alienating some of the women in the collar counties around Philadelphia? I think there's a real strategic decision to be made there, and they may try to balance those two persona, but it's hard.
It's funny because I was recently at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, and I was talking to some of his supporters about how they thought he had been adjusting to his new opponent. And one of them, it really stuck with me. He said, look, I like the name calling. I like the personal attacks. I find them entertaining. But there are a bunch of undecided voters out there, and I'm kind of worried he's not thinking about them. And my sense is you can never take your base for granted if you're a political candidate. But I think Trump, when he talks about abortion and he's moved a bit more toward a liberal perspective on abortion, he understands that his people are going to turn out and be excited to vote for him. But you don't necessarily see that in his rhetoric, because it's almost like he likes pleasing them and making them happy, but he has a little bit of leeway to soften his image and try to make himself more palatable to people who are a little bit concerned. But whether he actually wants to do that, I think is the real question, even though strategically it might be the right move for him.
Looking forward to the election, I guess my big question for Trump is how he positions himself in Pennsylvania. And then for Harris, she has this absolutely enormous trove of cash. It's really an extraordinary level of campaign cash. And so the question is what she does with it. And interestingly, earlier in September, the Harris campaign said that they would give almost $25 million to down ballot races to House and Senate Democrats, which is far more than is usually spent. And then for the Harris-Walz campaign's own spending, they're going to be pouring a ton of money, $370 million in advertising through November. So I think if you're in one of these key swing states, it is going to be impossible to avoid the ads from the Harris-Walz campaign. And I think those ads will include a lot of the material that Trump provided them in this debate.
Okay, Idris will be back next week. He's been off doing some reporting on what would happen if Harris wins in November and the Trump campaign contests the result. He's got some really interesting in-the-weeds reporting, so do tune in for that episode. For those who are new to Checks and Balance, we have a quiz at the end of every episode, and it's highly competitive. Adam, Charlotte, the other big political news of the week was, of course, that Taylor Swift has endorsed Kamala Harris. Now I'm going to give you a list of celebrities, and I want you to tell me which president they supported. Okay, question 1. Humphrey Bogart, Rita Hayworth, Orson Welles, and Frank Sinatra.
That would have been in... Did they support Eisenhower?
I'll guess JFK.
It was FDR, a little bit earlier. Question 2. Okay, the 4 here. Harry Belafonte, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Frank Sinatra.
That's JFK.
The full Rat Pack. That is indeed JFK. That's a point and a woot woot. Question 3. Cary Grant, Charlton Heston, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Frank Sinatra.
Reagan.
Sinatra cropping up a lot here. It was Reagan. I think you were there just first, Charlotte. So, as is usually the case, a storming victory for you. Congratulations.
I'm feeling good in relative terms.
Yeah, it seems that you had a concept of a plan for your quiz preparation this week.
Yes, with Idris gone, it's easier to win a quiz. No offense, Adam. But Idris is going to be on stage with our editor-in-chief, as well as one of the hosts of Drum Tower, David Rennie, and Sophie Petter, who's our Paris bureau chief. They are going to be talking about the impact of elections around the world in 2024 in Washington, D.C. on September 25th. Also in New York, but those tickets are already sold out for September 24th. So come if you're in the Washington area. We would really love to see you on September 25th. You get to see Idris in the flesh, as well as Zanny Mitten-Beddoes, our editor-in-chief, and other top editors. So I think it'll be a fantastic evening. You can sign up by going to economist.com/DC event.
Yeah, and these live events we do don't come around that often, so do snap up a ticket if you can make it. That's all for this episode. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The episode was produced by Harriet Noble with help from Marguerite Howell. Wei Dong Lin is our sound engineer. If you like the podcast, then please do let people know and leave us a rating and a review. That helps other people to find Checks and Balance. And don't forget, it's economist.com/podcasts plus to sign up for a free trial of all our podcasts. You can also get in touch with us via email if you'd like to do that. We really enjoy getting emails from our listeners. The address for that is podcasts@economist.com. In the meantime, thanks very much for listening. We'll have more Checks and Balance next week.